Hey guys, tonight we begin in a place where lightning bolts are tossed like confetti, shape-shifting is a casual hobby, and family reunions usually involve someone getting turned into a tree. Welcome to Mount Olympus, home of the gods, and a neighborhood you probably wouldn't survive a week in. Not because of the altitude, but because someone up there is always falling in love with the wrong mortal or turning their sibling into a goat. You hover near the clouds as the sun sets in swirls of molten gold. Through a marble colonnade, you peer into a grand dining hall filled with reclining immortals, all artfully disinterested in one another. This is family dinner on Olympus, weekly, mandatory, and wildly dysfunctional. Zeus, the king of the gods, lounges at the head of the table in a toga that seems to shimmer with thunderclouds. He's bored. You can tell because he's tapping his golden goblet with his pinky and scanning the divine room like someone about to cause problems on purpose. Across from him, Hera, his wife and sister, because of course, is watching him with that thin-lipped expression married people get when they know. She doesn't say anything yet, but her eyebrow is rising like a thunderstorm on the horizon. If you're familiar with Greek mythology, you already know this never ends well. Ares is there too, polishing a spear and flexing for no one in particular. Apollo is composing a haiku in his mashed grapes. Athena has brought her own scroll and refuses to make eye contact with anyone. Dionysus is in the corner, trying to make his wine turn into frogs again just for fun. It's chaos in togas. But Zeus is restless. That's the first red flag. Whenever he gets this way, it usually means some unsuspecting mortal is about to have their day dramatically rearranged. The thing is, he's already gone through the usual checklist. Lightning bolts, eagles, disguising himself as a shower of gold, don't ask. Now he's scanning the mortal realm like someone scrolling late-night shopping channels. And then, just like that, he sees her. Leda, Queen of Sparta, wife of Tyndareus, graceful, poised, and this is key, minding her own business, which is, unfortunately, a magnetic trait to bored sky gods. She's walking through a garden of olive trees, surrounded by handmaidens, humming some forgotten tune. And Zeus, from 30,000 feet above, is struck, not by lightning, but by his own absurd whims. Now, historians still argue whether Zeus fell in love with her at first sight, or if he simply decided she was a convenient candidate for his next disguise experiment. But either way, something clicks. And instead of doing the sensible thing, like writing her a letter or maybe not interfering with her life at all, he decides it's time to spice things up. But here's the twist. No golden eagle this time. No sudden thunderclouds or dream visitations. Nope, this time, Zeus decides he's going to be a swan. Yes, a swan. Elegant white neck like a question mark, known for being slightly aggressive at pawns. Very on brand. And just like that, your view of Mount Olympus fades. The bickering gods dissolve into mist, the dining hall echoes with the clinking of ambrosia goblets and passive-aggressive remarks, and you drift downward, slowly, softly toward the mortal world. Toward Sparta. Toward a quiet palace, a royal woman with sharp cheekbones and a collection of silks, and the flap of snowy wings overhead. You land in a cedar grove outside the palace. It smells of dry bark and lavender. There's a humming in the air, like something about to begin. And perched silently atop a column is a swan, feathers far too perfect, eyes a little too knowing. He's here. And you, my friend, are officially stuck in one of the weirdest love stories mythology has to offer. But hey, before we dive deeper into this feather-filled fiasco, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I make these long, sleepy dives into history and myth to help you unwind, and your support keeps the story flowing. Also, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing this sleepy little corner of the internet stretch across time zones. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The garden path crunches underfoot. The olive trees sway, and in the distance, a swan begins to descend. Graceful, yes, but with the unsettling poise of someone who knows exactly what they're about to mess up. You step into Sparta quietly, like a dream slipping in before the roosters crow. The city is just waking up, stone streets warming in the morning sun, a bronze shield clanging somewhere in the training grounds, and the smell of lentils simmering in a corner hearth. You pass by vendors arranging baskets of figs, young boys racing barefoot toward the agora, and the low murmur of priestesses lighting the first temple incense. But today, we're not interested in warriors or markets or omens in goat livers. Today, we're following Leda. The Queen of Sparta walks along the outer palace gardens wrapped in a pale linen shawl, soft as moth wings. She isn't flashy, not in the way Helen will be later. But there's something stately in her stride, like she's always walking a procession even when it's just her and the wind. She checks on the lemon trees, pauses to pick a blossom, and absent-mindedly brushes her fingers over the petals. Her attendants follow at a respectful distance, gossiping in hushed tones about someone's scandalous sandals. Leda's life on paper is golden. Married to King Tyndarus, an older, practical man who mostly leaves her alone to run things. Her children at this point include a couple of sturdy sons and one daughter who can already outrun half the palace guards. There's embroidery, temple duties, state dinners with other city-states where everyone compliments everyone's bronze work. And yet behind her temple offerings and polite nods, you sense it, a whisper of boredom. Not the dramatic, swooning kind, just the everyday sort, the kind that comes from years of routine, from knowing how every courtier will finish their sentence, from being told you're important but never surprised by anything anymore. Which is probably why the bird catches her attention. It shows up once, just once at first. Leda is feeding the doves near the pond, scattering crumbs onto a marble ledge when something large and snowy glides in low over the water. The other birds scatter in a panic, but this one lands with absurd grace, neck arched like a question, eyes bright as sunlit amber. It's a swan, but not like the swans you've seen in storybooks. No, this one is too elegant. Its feathers don't ruffle in the wind. Its wings don't twitch. When it turns to look at Leda, it's not the blank gaze of an animal. It's the lingering glance of someone who knows exactly how long they've held eye contact. She laughs, just a breath of a sound, and shakes her head. Probably assumes it's one of Artemis's strange woodland gifts again. The gods are always sending symbolic animals to noblewomen. You learn to ignore it. The swan doesn't approach. It waits. And then in one long, fluid movement, it dips its beak and glides into the pond. It vanishes into the reeds. But Leda, she's suddenly awake. There's a spark in her now, not infatuation, not yet, but interest. Mainstream historians describe Leda as one of the few mortal queens who managed her household with distinction and dignity, which is ancient scholar code for had her stuff together. But fringe theorists? They've pointed to fragments of poetry suggesting she used to write riddles in bird feather ink and leave them under the palace eaves, that she believed dreams could be bargained with if you burned the right herbs, that she once fasted for 7 days until a dove landed on her wrist and whispered a name in her ear. No one can prove these stories, but they hang around her like a delicate perfume, unprovable but strangely plausible. Which brings us back to the swan, because it starts showing up again. Always around the same hour, mid-morning, when the dew has faded and the garden is warm. It perches on a column. It stands at the far edge of the reflecting pool. It doesn't come close, never demands her attention, just is there. And Leda finds herself waiting for it. She doesn't ask anyone about it, doesn't send her servants to investigate. She simply adds a cushion to the stone bench near the pond, starts wearing the blue shawl that catches the sunlight better, plucks a few extra wildflowers on her way down. And every day the swan is there, a quiet presence, a question not yet asked. Meanwhile, in Mount Olympus, the gods are not impressed. Apollo rolls his eyes when he hears what Zeus is up to. "A swan, really?" he says, plucking his lyre strings. "You're not even trying anymore." Ares laughs so hard he drops a helmet. Hera just tightens her jaw and mutters something about abusing divine privileges and sleeping in the stable for a century. But Zeus doesn't care. He's invested now. He's fluffed his feathers. He's rehearsed the exact angle at which he'll glide into Leda's arms like a misunderstood feathered poet. Historians still argue whether Leda suspected anything. Some say she knew from the first moment and just played along. Others claim she was completely unaware and thought it was all part of some divine riddle. And then there are those who believe she wasn't the target at all, that Zeus intended to distract Sparta from something else entirely, and Leda was just collateral beauty. Whatever the case, the moment is approaching. You feel it like static in the garden air. Leda closes her eyes on the bench. The swan drifts closer than it ever has, close enough to brush her hem. And though she never says a word aloud, You can almost hear her thoughts. What do you want, bird, and why do I want to find out? The next morning, there's a hush in the palace air. Not the quiet of sleeping servants or unfinished breakfast trays, but something more watchful, like the walls are listening, like the garden itself is holding its breath. Lita wakes before dawn, slipping from her linen sheets as the stars still cling to the edge of the sky. The marble floors are cool against her bare feet as she moves through the hallways, past the flickering oil lamps, past the quiet guards pretending not to notice her early wanderings. She doesn't head to the temple or the throne room. No, she heads straight for the gardens. Because she knows the Swan will be waiting. And sure enough, just as the sun begins to rise, a pale gold spilling slowly across the stone paths, there it is. Perched on the edge of the fountain, head bowed like a knight awaiting orders, is the Swan. This time it doesn't remain at a distance. It steps closer. Each webbed foot lands with a soft plap on the marble. Its wings slightly raise, not in aggression, but like a prelude to music, and its neck extends toward her like a question she's about to answer. And Lita, to her own surprise, doesn't step back. You watch as she kneels slowly, her hand hovering just above the creature's crown. For a moment, she hesitates. Then, as though led by something older than thought, she rests her fingers against the feathers. They are warmed. Not like a bird, like flesh. Like something that shouldn't be warm but is unsettlingly so, and in that exact instant something shifts. The air thickens, the trees still. Somewhere in the distance, a crow lets out a single bark of laughter before flying away, like even it wants no part in this. The Swan looks up, and the sky cracks open. Now, to be fair, this part of the myth has more versions than Dionysus has wine skins. Some say Zeus revealed his identity immediately, poofed into his god form in a blaze of lightning and poorly timed romance poetry. Others claim he kept the swan form throughout the entire encounter, which raises many logistical questions we're not going to unpack in a sleep video. And then there's the fringe school of thought that argues it wasn't even Zeus at all, but some magical omen misunderstood by later poets. Historians still argue whether the original myth was meant to be taken literally or symbolically, whether the swan represented purity, temptation, celestial interference, or just a cautionary tale about keeping your ponds clean. But what does seem consistent is that something happened. And afterward, the garden was never quite the same. Lita returns to the palace in a daze, the hem of her dress damp with dew, her fingers still curled slightly as if they remember the curve of feathers. She says nothing. The handmaidens whisper, but they don't ask. Tyndaris, her husband, remember him? Doesn't seem to notice. Or perhaps he notices everything and wisely decides to stay silent. After all, this is Sparta. You don't challenge divine weirdness, you just sidestep it and keep your goats well fed. Days pass, then a week. And then Lita begins to feel strange. Her appetite shifts. She starts craving olives stuffed with honey. She can't sleep unless there's birdsong nearby. And most concerning of all, she finds herself strangely drawn to nests, stopping by them in trees, rearranging fallen twigs, humming absent-mindedly while smoothing the woven edges. You, being a reasonably modern and logical person, may suspect what's coming. But Lita, she's still clinging to the hope that maybe this is just a seasonal illness, a hiccup in her perfectly controlled courtly rhythm. Maybe she just needs a good night's sleep and fewer swans in her life. Until one morning, when she wakes with an odd pressure in her abdomen. And a few hours later, she lays an egg. Yes, an actual full-sized, glistening egg. You're understandably concerned. The palace physicians are baffled. The midwives won't go near it. The kitchen staff flees every time it moves, which it does sometimes ever so slightly, as though something inside is stretching. And then comes the second egg. Because of course there's a second egg. Lita lies in bed, one hand over her forehead, the other resting on the shell, and mutters something like, "I swear to the gods, if this is because I fed that bird too much bread." The eggs are placed gently in the warmest room in the palace. Not for incubation. Spartan nobility don't do that sort of thing. But mostly because no one wants to be the person who throws away something that might contain divine royalty. And then, after 7 long days, the first one cracks. A burst of light, A sound like a harp string snapping, and out comes Helen. She doesn't cry, she doesn't squint, she just stares. Even covered in eggshell and swaddled in a linen napkin, she's already breathtaking. The nurses gasp. One of them faints. A bronze mirror warps slightly just trying to reflect her. And everyone in the room feels it in their bones. This child is going to cause problems. But that's for later. Right now, Lita lies back, eyes wide, and whispers the only reasonable thing left to say in this moment. I really should have ignored that Swan. You find yourself standing beside the hearth in the palace nursery, watching sunlight spill across the stone floor in long, golden beams. There are birds nesting in the rafters, sparrows, mostly, and one daring magpie that keeps attempting to steal a spoon from the swaddling table. Lita sits upright now, pale but composed, her posture as regal as ever despite the circumstances. Beside her rest 2 open eggshells, neatly cracked, oddly smooth, and already being catalogued by the court scribes who are pretending this is all very normal. Because here in Sparta, when the queen gives birth to 2 human children from eggs, you write it down and keep your opinions to yourself. The second egg has hatched too. Out of it come the twins, Castor and Pollux. Depending on which version of the myth you believe, only one of them is fully divine. Scholars still squabble over which one, Castor with his mortal strength and level head, or Pollux with his divine charisma and suspicious immunity to hangovers. You watch as the 2 babies sleep in a basket beside Helen, who, though newly born, is already managing to look vaguely judgmental. Mainstream history, as dull as it often is, notes that Castor and Pollux would grow up to become legendary horsemen and heroes, eventually immortalized as the constellation Gemini. But we'll get to that. Right now, we're focused on their sister. Helen. She doesn't coo, she doesn't giggle. She simply stares at the ceiling with eyes the color of forged bronze, and everyone in the room begins quietly reassessing their life choices. Even the high priest, a man who once sacrificed an ox during a thunderstorm without flinching, decides now is a good time to go check on the temple roof. As the days pass, the palace adjusts. Rooms are redecorated. Nurses trained in normal infant care are quietly replaced by priestesses who specialize in divine anomalies. There's a lot of incense, whispered chants, and awkward silences whenever someone mentions birds. Lita returns to court life with the grace of someone who refuses to let her new maternal status interfere with her wardrobe. She holds Helen at council meetings. She feeds the twins during royal banquets. And when visiting dignitaries inquire about the origins of her children, she smiles sweetly and replies, "The gods have their reasons," which is the ancient Greek equivalent of saying, "Mind your business." Meanwhile, Zeus is watching from Mount Olympus like a proud but extremely distant father. He doesn't visit, not directly, but sometimes when Helen cries, there's a low rumble of thunder in the sky. When she giggles, sunlight bursts through the clouds like a spotlight. Hera, of course, notices all this and is not amused. You might wonder, how does Tyndarus, the mortal king and supposed father, react to all this? Here's the odd part, he plays along. Perhaps he's deluded, perhaps he's deeply in denial, or perhaps, and this is the theory most favored by scholars who wear sandals indoors, he simply knew better than to argue with fate. After all, it's not every day your wife lays eggs that produce semi-divine triplets. You either accept it or run screaming into the sea. He chooses acceptance. He raises the children as his own, signs off on their names, funds their education, makes sure the twins learn swordplay and Helen learns politics, diplomacy, and how to smile in a way that causes minor earthquakes. But not everything is smooth. Whispers spread, as they always do. One courtier swears he saw Helen's eyes glow in the dark. Another claims that Castor was bitten by a viper and simply frowned at it until it slithered away in shame. And one particularly nervous poet insists that he saw a swan gliding above the palace every full moon, circling 3 times before vanishing into mist. Of course, that could just be poetic license, or it could be Zeus checking in. Lita tries to keep the family grounded. She insists on regular meals, modest tunics, and thank-you notes for temple offerings. She tells Helen bedtime stories that emphasize humility, though it's hard to make an impression when your daughter radiates ancient energy and already knows how to command a room without speaking. Fringe scholars argue that Leda may have had some divine spark herself, hidden, dormant, perhaps passed down from an ancestor who once angered a nymph. They point to obscure lines in later poetry referring to her as she who tamed the swan or egg-bearer of veiled thunder. Whatever the truth, she's certainly not ordinary. And the household adapts. There's a rhythm now, morning prayers, afternoon lessons, evening walks beneath the cypress trees. Helen listens intently when stories of Troy or Mycenae are told. Pollux practices wrestling with kitchen staff twice his size. Castor reads aloud to the palace cats, who seem to understand perfectly. And through it all there is peace. For now, because peace in mythology is always a borrowed season. The storm clouds are always gathering behind the tapestry. But in this moment you're safe in the warm glow of the nursery fire. Leda hums an old lullaby about the constellations. The twins snore gently. Helen dreams with her eyes open. And somewhere far above the mortal realm, a swan glides silently across the sky, carving invisible paths through the stars. You're back in the Spartan palace courtyard now, where the sun has bleached the flagstones into a soft gold, and bees hum lazily around the olive trees. The palace is calm, unusually calm, considering there are now 3 divine or semi-divine children living within its walls. But peace, as always, is deceptive. Because over the next few weeks, Zeus begins to get creative. You see, shape-shifting once into a swan, no less, is apparently not enough for the king of Olympus. He's taken a shine to the whole transformation thing. It's become a bit of a hobby, an escape from the heavy crown, the endless council meetings, and the ongoing passive-aggressive marriage with Hera, who has now started referring to him exclusively as Featherbrain. And so Zeus starts experimenting. One day he appears on a hillside in Arcadia as a handsome shepherd who plays the flute. Another, he's seen in Thessaly disguised as a particularly majestic bull. There are rumors of him turning into mist, into an eagle, into, yes, somehow, an entire poem whispered into a young woman's dreams. Historians still argue whether this sudden burst of creativity was part of a broader divine plan, or just a mid-eternity crisis. Back in Sparta, Leda is trying very hard not to notice the frequency with which birds now visit her balcony. It starts with 1 or 2, innocent enough, a dove here, a robin there, but then come the herons, the ibis, a particularly suspicious peacock that definitely winks at her. She starts drawing the curtains more often. But the gods, they're not done with her. You see, Hera is still watching from Olympus. And Hera, goddess of marriage, queen of grudges, has not forgotten that awkward dinner conversation where everyone pretended Zeus hadn't recently turned himself into poultry. Hera's fury isn't loud. It's subtle, chilly, the sort of anger that manifests in oddly timed hailstorms, sudden spoilage of temple grapes, and a dramatic uptick in rumors about Leda's children. One priest claims Helen's laughter causes his goats to faint. A merchant swears that when Castor speaks, his shadow moves a beat too late. And as for Pollux, let's just say the wrestling ring he built in the garden now has a wait list longer than the Delphic oracles. Meanwhile, Zeus remains aloof. He doesn't contact Leda directly, but occasionally she finds strange things in her chambers, a feather tucked beneath her pillow, a single white stone arranged in the shape of a swan on her windowsill, a puddle of water that reflects the sky even at night. She says nothing, but she starts walking in the gardens at dawn again. Maybe she's hoping to find answers, maybe she's trying to reclaim the silence, or maybe, just maybe, she misses the bird. It's during one of these early walks that she passes a group of servants chatting quietly by the fountain. They're gossiping, as servants do, but their topic makes her stop. Said he turned into a golden snake this time. Again, didn't he try that last spring with that girl in Crete? She said it glowed inside her tent. Leda doesn't blink, just walks slowly past them, her expression carved from polite stone. But inside, oh, inside she's furious. Because here's the thing about Leda. She never asked for this. She never signed up to be the star of a myth. And now, thanks to one meddling god with a feather complex, she's a mother to 2, maybe 3 demigods, the object of gossip across half of Greece, and the punchline of too many symposium jokes. She begins writing poetry again. Not the gentle verses of her youth, but sharp-edged lines full of metaphors and sly insults. The kind of poetry that gets passed around temples in hushed tones and eventually misattributed to men. Fringe scholars argue that one such scroll, known only as the Swan's Complaint, may have been penned by Leda herself. In it, the narrator describes being visited by a divine bird who leaves her with eggs full of storm and silence. It ends with the line, "And still he flies, forgetting the nest." It's unsigned, but the handwriting, some say, matches a fragment found in Sparta's ruins, scratched into the underside of a laurel leaf-shaped bronze mirror. Back in the present moment, the children are thriving. Helen has started asking questions no one wants to answer, about beauty power and why everyone stares when she enters a room. Castor practices swordplay with terrifying focus. Pollux once knocked over a temple pillar just by sneezing. Tyndareus continues to nod supportively and commission extra scrolls about parenting. And Leda, she keeps walking at dawn. She wears a swan feather braided into her hair, not out of longing, not quite, but as a reminder, a talisman, a warning. Zeus doesn't return. Not in swan form, not in mist, not as a whisper in her sleep. But every so often, when the breeze shifts just right, Leda tilts her head and listens. Because somewhere above, high in Olympus or far beyond, wings still beat softly across the clouds. The sun creeps over the rooftops of Sparta, gilding the tiled eaves and warming the dusty courtyards where olive trees rustle faintly in the early breeze. Inside the palace, servants tiptoe through the halls, arms full of laundry and fresh honey cakes, speaking in murmurs lest they wake the children. But it's not the children they're really worried about. It's Hera. She hasn't shown up in person yet, but the signs are there. A mirror cracking along the frame of its own accord, a priestess struck suddenly mute during morning prayers, a flock of geese refusing to leave the palace bathhouse. You've been around these myths long enough to recognize a jealous goddess when you see one. Hera doesn't shout, she doesn't throw lightning bolts. No, her wrath is far more refined. She waits, she watches, and when the moment is right, she applies pressure exactly where it hurts. This week, it's Leda's reputation. Whispers start circulating through the palace. First among the noblewomen at the temple baths, soft-voiced theories spoken behind steam screens. She walks too often alone, at dawn no less. 2 eggs, really, not even one? Curious, isn't it? Maybe it wasn't even Zeus. Maybe she's just telling stories. Leda hears it, of course. She always does. She says nothing, as usual. But the next time she walks through the gardens, her footsteps are firmer. The swan feather in her braid is tied with red thread now, not blue. And when a high-ranking courtier tries to offer a veiled joke about breakfast and eggs, she smiles sweetly and responds, "Careful, some shells still hold lightning." That shuts him up. But the tension lingers. Even Helen feels it. She's still a child, yes, but already the kind who absorbs the temperature of a room like marble under sunlight. She stops laughing so easily, starts watching people more carefully, as if trying to gauge whether their smiles mean what they say. Meanwhile, Zeus is doing exactly what you'd expect from a god with the attention span of a mayfly and the emotional maturity of a bronze spoon. He's distracted. There's a new muse in Boeotia, a festival in Naxos he simply has to attend, a bet with Poseidon about whether he can charm a dryad using only bird calls and hair gel made from ambrosia. Mount Olympus, at this moment, resembles less a divine council and more a dysfunctional theater troupe mid-rehearsal. Athena refuses to comment on the bird incident. Dionysus has started selling novelty eggshells at mortal wine tastings. And Apollo has composed an incredibly passive-aggressive song about shape-shifting that he insists has nothing to do with Zeus, but includes a suspicious number of swan references. And Hera, she's had enough. She decides it's time to get involved, not with thunder or fury, but with a plan. A long, slow, quiet plan, the best kind. She begins visiting temples in disguise. A veiled matron here, a wandering priestess there. She listens. She spreads just enough suggestion, barely a breath of implication, that perhaps Leda's children are unnatural, that their beauty is too perfect, that maybe Sparta isn't meant to keep what rightfully belongs on Olympus. Historians still argue whether Hera's campaign ever went beyond rumors. Some say she tried to have Helen taken from the palace and raised in a temple. Others claim she commissioned a prophecy from Delphi with deliberately vague warnings about a face that would ignite nations. Whatever the truth, the result is clear. People begin to treat Helen not as a child, but as a prophecy. She's no longer little Helen who likes fig tarts and shadow puppets. She's the Helen, the one with the glinting eyes and unplaceable aura. The girl who, if you stare too long, makes you forget what you were doing. Lita sees it, and it scares her. Not because she doubts her daughter, but because she knows exactly what happens to women who become symbols before they become people. And she's powerless to stop it. One day, Helen comes home from the temple lessons with olive leaves braided into her hair, eyes serious. "Mother," she says, "why does everyone look at me like I've already done something wrong?" Lita crouches before her, smoothing the edge of her tunic. The answer she wants to give is, because the gods made you a riddle, not a child. But she doesn't. She simply says, because people fear what they don't understand. And Helen, with the gravity of someone far older than her years, nods once. Good. Meanwhile, down by the reflecting pool, a new kind of bird has started showing up. Not swans, not doves, ravens, sharp-eyed, quiet, watching. It's unclear if they're Hera's spies or just unusually stylish crows. But the message is clear. The gods are not done. Not with Lita, not with Helen, not with this family. And you, drifting through the halls of myth and marble, realize something else too. This is no longer just a story about a swan. This is the beginning of something bigger, a spark in a dry forest, a whisper before the storm. The feathers have settled, but the wind is starting to rise. You're standing at the edge of a wide marble terrace, looking out over the rooftops of Sparta. The morning haze wraps the city in soft gold, and from somewhere nearby, the clatter of spears and sandals signals the start of another day of drills for the boys in training. But you're not focused on them. Your eyes drift down to the riverbank beyond the palace walls. And there, just there, you see her. Lita, alone again. She's wearing a deep green peplos today, hem lifting in the breeze, her sandals leaving faint impressions in the damp earth as she walks slowly along the bank. The reeds sway beside her like curious children, brushing against her fingertips when she passes. It's been months now since the eggs, since Zeus's disappearance, since the quiet wrath of Hera began making itself known. And though Lita remains composed on the surface, graceful, diplomatic, maddeningly regal, something beneath has shifted. You see it in the way she walks slower now, as if reluctant to go wherever she's going. You hear it in the way she breathes, more deeply, like each inhale is a small act of defiance. She hasn't spoken of the swan, not since the morning she left the second eggshell in the hearth fire and watched it crackle to ash. But you know she remembers. Everyone does. And not just in Sparta. Word has begun to spread across the Aegean, drifting from one port town to the next. Strange births in Sparta, a girl more radiant than the moon, a queen whose garden grew feathers, a king who never asks questions. Even in Athens, travelers now speak of the egg-born girl. In Delos, a wandering bard composes a song called Feathers at Dawn, and in Delphi, the oracles start twitching when Helen's name is spoken aloud. You'd think this would alarm the gods, but most of them are bored again. Poseidon is hosting an underwater chariot race. Hermes has opened a pop-up sandal shop with winged soles. Aphrodite is pretending not to notice Helen at all, which is frankly more insulting than any compliment. Zeus, let's just say he's around. Still dropping feathers in odd places. Still making cloud formations that suspiciously resemble Lita reclining on a throne. But he hasn't appeared to her again. Not directly. Which leaves Lita to process things on her own. And today, as she walks by the river, she stops by a smooth boulder just at the water's edge, sits, folds her hands, and stares at her reflection. You drift closer. The current is slow, the surface still. And for a moment she looks young, younger than the queen, younger than the mother, just Lita. A woman who once chased fireflies through olive groves and wrote love poems to boys who smelled like cypress. She reaches into the water, swirls her fingers, then slowly draws out what else? A single white feather. No bird in sight, No breeze, just a feather floating. She smiles, but it doesn't reach her eyes. Of course, she whispers, you always send something. Here's the thing, ancient myths never really explain how Zeus's chosen mortals deal with the aftermath. Once the gods vanish, the stories usually shift focus to the children, the wars, the grand events that fill epics. But Leda, she keeps living. Wakes up, eats olives, writes lists, tells Helen to be polite, nods during meetings about border disputes, trims rose bushes, avoids mirrors. Historians still argue whether Leda ever believed she'd been visited by Zeus himself. Some say she thought it all a dream, a fever brought on by too much sun. Others claim she knew exactly what, and who, she was dealing with and simply chose not to resist. There's even one obscure tablet fragment from Lesbos suggesting Leda invited the Swan, calling it to her through rituals now lost. Regardless, she never confirms anything, not to Tyndaris, not to the priests, not even to Helen. Especially not to Helen, because Helen, now 7, has begun asking questions. Big ones. Why do I look different from Castor? Why do the women at the temple bow when they see me? Why do I dream of white wings every time it rains? And Leda, proud, poised, painfully human Leda, answers with the only tools she has, half-truths and lullabies. Because you're special, little one. Because the gods have plans. Because some dreams are older than memory. Meanwhile, the Swan sightings return. Not in flocks, not in any obvious pattern, but every few weeks someone swears they saw one gliding silently across the palace roof at twilight. No wing beats, no shadow, just a shape gleaming white against the fading sky. Even the palace dogs grow skittish. They bark at empty corners and whimper when the moon is full. And Leda, she doesn't chase it. She waits. Because if there's one thing she's learned, it's this: gods don't show up on command, but they always return when they want something. And this time, Leda intends to be ready. She started visiting the old priestess in the hills outside the city, an ancient woman with eyes like stones and herbs that smell of lightning. No one knows her real name, but the locals call her the Crooked Feather. Leda brings her honey cakes and wine. In return, she learns things, quiet things, dangerous things, how to bind a dream, how to soften divine footprints, how to speak in riddles that confuse even the cleverest of gods. She never tells anyone about these visits, not even Helen. But you know, you're there in the shadows, watching as she crushes blue petals into oil, etches symbols into walnut wood, ties strands of her own hair around stones from the riverbed. She's preparing. For what? Even she doesn't fully know. But the next time Zeus comes calling, whether in feathers or fog, Leda won't be the same. She won't be the soft queen wandering her garden, humming to herself, wondering what it all meant. She'll be ready to answer the god with silence. And maybe, just maybe, that'll be enough. The sun is high and hot over Sparta, casting hard-edged shadows across the stone walkways and temple courtyards. Cicadas sing without pause, like they're narrating the world's longest soap opera in a single note. But inside the palace, behind thick woven curtains and perfumed air, something far stranger than the heat is unfolding. You're in the royal nursery again. Only now it smells like feathers. Not in a metaphorical way, in a very real, unmistakable way. A soft, downy musk that clings to everything, to the linen cushions, to the wood of the cradle, to the gold-threaded tapestry that Helen keeps wrapping herself in for no reason other than it feels like clouds. And nestled in the corner of the room are 2 items that no one can explain, and no one dares move. 2 broken eggshells. You thought they'd be gone by now, didn't you? Tossed, buried, thrown into the sea to appease the gods. But Leda had them polished, sealed with resin, mounted gently on cedar bases and placed side by side on a carved shelf. She said it was to remind her of where the children came from. But everyone else, they say it's because she's still trying to understand what happened. And let's be honest, you are too. Because these aren't just eggshells, they shimmer in candlelight. They vibrate faintly when Helen cries. Castor swears one of them hummed when he scraped his knee. Pollux tried to wear one as a helmet until it zapped him and left his hair standing on end for 3 days. And Helen, she talks to them. Not often, just little whispers, usually when no one else is looking. You once heard her tell one of the shells that she dreamed of flying, and the next morning a falcon landed on the palace roof and refused to leave for a week. So now they're part of daily life, like ceremonial urns or strange, feather-scented roommates. But it doesn't stop there, because Lita isn't the only one who remembers the strange day by the river. The court does too, and lately the whispers have returned, not about Lita but about the children. People have begun to argue over which of the twins is fully divine. Some swear it's Castor because of his quiet strength and eerie calm. Others claim it must be Pollux, whose laughter is too loud, whose jumps are too high, who once survived a fall from the palace roof with nothing but a twisted ankle and a comment about the wind catching him. And then there's Helen. No one debates her status. She is different. You feel it when she walks into a room, not just beauty, which she has, absurdly, but presence. Her gaze is too steady, her silence is too long. She once asked the high priest if mortals could choose not to be part of a prophecy, and he pretended to faint just to escape the question. Even the palace pets avoid her when she's thinking. The other children in the court are wary. They don't tease her. They don't play pranks. They greet her formally, like she's already sitting on a throne they can't see. Which is why, when the new oracle arrives from Delphi, there's a ripple through the palace. Her name is Thyone. She's young for an oracle, only just past 20, but already speaks in layered metaphors and drinks water like it's wine. She says she felt a pull from the east. That something in Sparta smells of forgotten thunder. And she makes a beeline for the nursery. No hesitation. No announcement. She walks straight in, stares at the eggshells, and nods like she's confirming a recipe. Then she kneels before Helen. "Hail," she whispers, "breaker of calm." Everyone freezes. Thyone smiles, as if this is perfectly normal oracle behavior. Helen just blinks. Breaker of calm? That's not a name you give someone who collects seashells and likes fig paste. That's a name you give someone who will eventually, maybe accidentally, cause the unraveling of nations. Lita hears about it within the hour. She sends for Thyone, offers her wine, asks politely what she meant. Thyone replies, with all the maddening serenity of someone who definitely knows more than she's letting on. "I say only what the gods place on my tongue." Which is ancient Greek for, "Don't ask me to explain, I just work here." Historians still argue whether this particular oracle truly foresaw the Trojan War or merely stumbled into destiny like a sleepwalker through a banquet. Some believe she was planted by Hera, others think she was genuinely tuned into divine currents. There's even a theory that she was Helen, time-traveled and disguised, trying to warn herself. All speculative, all unprovable, all delightfully useless to Lita, who is now more concerned than ever. She begins doubling temple offerings. She burns cedar wood in the nursery every night. She forbids Helen from speaking to the eggshells, though of course Helen does anyway. And through it all, the children grow. Castor practices swordplay with the palace guards and never sweats. Pollux climbs the fig trees, so often they rename one after him. Helen begins memorizing every name in the palace, guards, servants, cooks. When asked why, she simply says, "It's easier when you know who'll be sad when you leave." You shiver, because you feel it now, the slow build, the weight of foreshadowing that clings to her like morning mist. She is becoming not just a child, but a symbol. And symbols, as you've learned by now, rarely get to choose their endings. The eggshells remain on their shelf, whole yet broken, like something waiting to begin again. It's mid-afternoon in Sparta, and the palace hums with that particular lazy tension that only heat and politics can bring. Servants fan important people who pretend not to sweat. Priests argue softly in shaded colonnades about whether olives count as divine offerings if they've been stuffed with cheese. You drift through the outer halls, past tapestries embroidered with lions, ships, and, oddly, a single white bird stitched in gold thread at the bottom corner of one. You pause, that wasn't their last time. Someone, it seems, has a sense of humor. But today's story isn't woven in thread, it's unfolding at the training grounds. Castor and Pollux, now well into their adolescence, are sparring before an audience of bored nobles and half-awake philosophers. Sweat glistens on their foreheads. The clatter of wooden blades echoes across the yard. Their footwork is flawless, precise, almost rehearsed, like they're more dance partners than brothers. And maybe they are. Because if you watch closely, you'll notice something. They move together, not just in rhythm but in instinct. When Castor strikes, Pollux anticipates the counter. When Pollux tumbles, Castor's already reaching out to catch him. It's uncanny. It's divine, but no one knows which of them carries the god blood. Not even Leda. Historians still debate this, whether only Pollux inherited immortality from Zeus while Castor remained mortal, or whether both shared the divine spark, just in different doses. There's even a scroll fragment from Mycenae suggesting that they were born of different fathers, despite being twins, a concept that forces ancient genealogists into fits of poetic denial. For now, the palace settles on a compromise. Both boys are exceptional. And that's enough. After the match, the boys collapse into the shade of a fig tree, sharing dates and laughing like only siblings can. Castor, ever the quiet one, starts carving shapes into the dirt, circles, lines, constellations. Pollux pretends not to watch, but when Castor finishes drawing the Gemini twins, Pollux reaches over and scuffs it out with a toe. Too soon, he grins. Castor just shrugs. You drift away before the argument can resume. Brotherly love comes with occasional wrestling, and find yourself outside the women's quarters, where Helen sits cross-legged on the floor, playing an ancient version of jacks with small bronze bones. She's alone. Again. Not because she's shunned, everyone wants to be near her, but because she exhausts people without trying. Her silence makes them babble. Her questions leave them fidgeting. Even the palace cat, a notoriously arrogant calico named Melantho, will sit on every lap but hers. But Helen doesn't seem to mind. She hums softly to herself, a tune that no one recognizes but somehow feels ancient. You catch a few notes and shiver, remembering a wind that once blew across the riverbank the day the Swan arrived. Helen's eyes flick up. She's staring straight ahead, but you get the unsettling feeling she's seen you. Not in the ghostly, you're in a story way, but in the unnervingly present, I know something you do way. Then she smiles, and just like that, the spell breaks. Leda enters, nodding once to the guards. She's wearing her hair in a braid wound with olive leaves, a silent signal to the court that she is both rooted and watching. She sits beside Helen without a word and begins sorting through small scrolls, etiquette drills, marriage proposals, genealogies, the usual concerns for the mother of the most beautiful girl in Greece. But today, Leda doesn't hand Helen any of them. Instead, she pulls out a tiny carved box, opens it. Inside is a single object, a fragment of one of the eggshells, smooth and pale, shaped like a crescent moon. Helen stares at it. Then softly, was it real? Leda doesn't blink, yes. Was it him? Pause, then, yes. Helen nods unsurprised. Will he come back? I don't know, Leda replies, though her voice wavers slightly. But if he does, we'll be ready. Helen closes the box, holds it in her lap like a talisman. Will I ever be normal? There it is. The question that's been lingering, waiting to be asked. The one that curls beneath every prophecy and stirs in every mirror. And Leda, tired but regal, answers as only a mother can. No, my love, but you will be yours, that's better. Fringe mythographers have always been fascinated by this stage of Helen's life, so underdocumented in epic poetry, so ripe with ambiguity. Some believe she disappeared from the records because the gods erased her childhood to enhance her mystique. Others argue that it's simply because the bards didn't care to write about a girl who hadn't yet ruined, or saved, anything. But here, in this quiet moment, Helen is neither legend nor ornament. She is a girl, a strange one, a brilliant one, and above all, a girl slowly realizing that her name no longer belongs entirely to her. Outside, Castor and Pollux chase each other through the garden, their laughter echoing off the palace walls. The sun begins to dip, casting everything in golden relief. And high above, just barely visible against the reddening sky, a single white feather drifts down. Helen catches it without moving, doesn't smile, doesn't speak, just tucks it behind her ear, and continues playing jacks. Evening settles over Sparta like warm silk, brushing the stone walls with soft shadows and curling around pillars like the hem of a forgotten hymn. The wind has calmed, and the fountains trickle faintly in the courtyards as lamps are lit, one by one, casting flickering halos over the palace paths. You find yourself in the great hall now, where a feast is underway. It's not a festival, not a holiday, just another night in a city that's learned how to dine like nothing strange is happening. There's roasted lamb and honey-glazed squash, and a suspicious amount of wine for something so midweek. At the head of the long table sits Tyndareus, stoic, silent, exactly as he's always been. He raises his goblet in a quiet toast as a flute player starts in the corner. The nobles murmur, raise theirs in turn, and smile the tight-lipped smiles of people who are all very aware they're sitting 3 seats away from prophecy in a dress. Because Helen is here too. She sits beside her mother, as poised as a marble figurine, nibbling olives like she hasn't already become the subject of 6 new temple songs this month alone. Her hair is braided into a crown. Her sandals glint with tiny gold swan motifs. Someone thought they were clever. But even tonight, among laughter and clinking goblets, you can feel the tension. Everyone at this table remembers. The eggs, the bird, the strange dreams that followed. No one says it, of course. They talk about trade deals and the latest shipment of cedar from Phoenicia. They pretend not to glance sideways at Helen when a feather drifts in through an open window. They laugh a little too hard when Pollux tells a joke about wrestlers and olive oil. But the unease sits there, unspoken but unmoving. It only gets worse when the visitor arrives. A herald enters, breathless, announcing a traveler from Thessaly. A prince, he says, well-mannered, interested in Sparta's strategic alliances. His name? Theseus. Yes, that Theseus. Slayer of the Minotaur, king of Athens, builder of a dozen half-truths and 24 accidental conquests. And now apparently suitor. Tyndareus invites him in with the weary grace of a man who has hosted too many demigods with too many opinions. Theseus strides into the room, charming smile ready, cloak billowing just so, eyes already locked on Helen. She does not smile. In fact, she does not look up at all. She's busy pouring herself more wine. But Theseus, he's undeterred. He introduces himself with a flourish, tells a clearly embellished story about wrestling a mountain lion in Arcadia, and even offers Pollux a mock challenge to duel. Pollux, to his credit, responds by flipping a grape into Theseus's goblet without looking. It lands. Tyndareus chuckles. Just a little. But Helen, she finally looks up. And when she does, the air shifts. Not because she's enchanted, not because she's impressed, but because she sees through him immediately and she lets it show. That stare, the one you've grown used to, isn't cruel. It's just ancient, like she's reading the last page of a story she's already tired of. Theseus doesn't notice, or maybe he pretends not to. He continues talking. He says he's heard stories about her, that her beauty is unmatched, that songs about her have reached the shores of Cyprus, that the gods themselves whisper her name. Helen blinks once, then says, "Do the gods whisper yours?" Oof. It lands like a pebble dropped into silence. Castor smothers a laugh in his cup. Pollux openly snorts. Theseus recovers quickly. He's used to verbal javelins, but the damage is done. He spends the rest of dinner slightly off balance, trying to win over a room that already decided they preferred the twins. Historians still argue whether this was the moment Helen became dangerous. Not with weapons, but with words. Some claim her sharp tongue was a gift from Aphrodite herself, meant to defend against the mortals who would never see her as anything but a prize. Others believe Helen trained herself to be this precise, crafting her voice into a shield before anyone could forge chains around her ankles. Either way, that night marks a change. From now on, suitors will come in waves. Some with poetry, some with promises, a few with entire fleets. Helen remains unmoved. Even Tyndareus, who had once hoped she might marry quietly and avoid divine drama, begins to realize that ship has not only sailed, it was never docked in the first place. Leda watches from her seat, lips tight. She says nothing, she never does at these dinners. But as she rises to leave, she gently rests her hand on Helen's shoulder. The gesture is brief, but it lingers. And later that night, when Helen is alone in her chamber, she finds another feather beneath her pillow. This one is different. Smaller, curved, iridescent with a violet shimmer. She holds it up to the moonlight, and for just a moment her shadow flickers, wings outstretched. She doesn't speak. She doesn't cry. She simply places the feather inside her carved box beside the eggshell fragment, and whispers, "Not yet." The palace rooster crows a little too early the next morning. Or maybe it just feels early because you've been drifting through dreams thick with feathers and the echo of names not yet spoken aloud. You float gently through the courtyard as Sparta stretches itself awake, all bronze and breakfast smoke and sandals slapping stone. Today, you find yourself in the council chamber. The mood tense. Tyndareus sits at the round table flanked by his advisors, each draped in layered chitons that wrinkle with the weight of worry. Scrolls are unrolled. Seals are broken. There's a lot of throat clearing and hand-wringing. Because Sparta has a problem. Helen, specifically, what to do with her. Not in a sinister way. No one's threatening her, perish the thought. But she's reached that inconvenient age where beauty, bloodline, and prophecy all start to collide like wine cups at a too-loud symposium. And the suitors are arriving. Not just one or two, not even 10. 27. From all corners of Greece. Athens, Corinth, Ithaca, Thebes, Rhodes, Mycenae. Each sending their best, their boldest, their most politically useful young men to Sparta, all with the same soft smile and tightly rehearsed line. "I seek your daughter's hand." And behind that smile, always the same unspoken subtext. And control of Sparta eventually. It's not subtle. Which is why Tyndareus now sits with his head in his hands, as one advisor proposes marrying Helen off to a merchant's son, and hiding her in a temple forever. Another suggests drawing lots. Another wants to consult Delphi again. One particularly ambitious fellow recommends letting them all duel in the courtyard. "Last one standing gets the girl," he says, wiping olive oil from his beard. That one gets no support. Eventually, Leda enters. Uninvited. Unhurried. And the room quiets. She doesn't shout, she never needs to. She simply walks to the table, places a folded linen square on the polished wood, and inside it, one of the feathers, swan white, untouched. It lies there like punctuation at the end of a dangerous sentence. "You all seem to have forgotten," she says quietly, "that the gods already chose her path." Tyndareus opens his mouth, closes it again. Leda continues, voice like dusk. "You cannot treat Helen like a jewel to be passed around. She's a storm, and you're debating which curtain to hang in front of her." The silence that follows is not comfortable. And from somewhere deep in the palace, as if summoned by irony itself, comes the distant sound of Pollux shouting, "Catch me," followed by a tremendous splash. Outside, one of the garden pools is now missing a significant amount of water. You drift away before the panic resumes. Later that afternoon, you find Helen on the rooftop terrace. Alone. Again. She's staring out across the rooftops, a wreath of poppy petals in her lap, plucking one at a time and letting the breeze take them. She loves me not, the gods love me, the gods do not love me," she murmurs, flicking the final petal away. Then, glancing up, "Are you watching?" At first you think she's talking to herself, maybe to the wind, but then you realize she's looking at the clouds. And above them, just faintly outlined against the fading blue, a shape. Wings broad, familiar. Zeus. Or at the very least, a reminder of him. She doesn't wave, doesn't speak, just watches, as if daring him to descend. But he doesn't. He never does. Back inside the palace, Leda is pacing. She's heard the latest rumor, that Menelaus, Prince of Mycenae, is arriving next week with a tribute of ivory, 3 horses, and a poet who only writes about her daughter's hair. She's exhausted. She visits the garden shed. Well, it used to be a shed. Now it's something else entirely. A place of quiet rituals, scrolls in secret languages, and little clay bowls filled with herbs that smell like memory and fire. She lights a small taper, offers a slice of apple, whispers the names of her children into the flame, not as prayer, not quite as spell. Just insurance. Historians still argue whether Leda ever practiced quiet magic. The official records say no. The poetry implies otherwise. One lost text even suggests that she invented an entire system of dream-binding charms to protect Helen's sleep. But that night, something changes. You're there again, drifting through the nursery, past the cradle that's now just decorative, past the shelf with the eggshell fragments and the little box of feathers. Helen is sitting by the open window. And she's glowing. Not in a supernatural way, not like moonlight or holy fire. Just fully herself. Every contour sharpened by purpose. She turns slightly, almost as if she hears you. I know they'll choose someone, she whispers, but it doesn't matter. You wonder what she means. And then she adds, because the war is already waiting. You want to ask her how she knows. But she's already turned back to the stars. And from the rooftop, unseen by all but you, another feather falls. Straight down, landing perfectly on the windowsill. Still warm. It's the day of the egg banquet. No one calls it that out loud, of course. Officially, it's a feast in honor of the arriving suitors, an evening of diplomacy, charm, and judging people based on how well they recite epics or pour wine. But everyone knows. Everyone remembers. And so does Helen. She stands at the top of the marble stairs in a pale tunic woven with silver thread, a swan feather clasp at her shoulder. Subtle but not subtle, her hair's braided like a river current. Her expression is unreadable. That makes it worse for the guests below. You're there too, of course, gliding among the assembled nobles, catching snippets of hushed commentary and uncomfortable laughter. There she is. She doesn't look mortal. I heard her gaze makes you forget your own name. One man drops his goblet before even speaking to her. It's going well. Tyndareus, ever the statesman, makes a brief speech about honor, diplomacy, and allowing fate to guide the hand of reason, which doesn't actually mean anything, but sounds sufficiently wise to silence the crowd. The suitors approach one by one. Odysseus of Ithaca, clever eyes, sharper tongue, offers logic over roses, brings no gift, just a proposal. Let me choose her husband for you, he says. In exchange, grant me her cousin Penelope. Tyndareus raises a brow, that's a twist. Ajax of Salamis, tall as a statue, voice like a drum, brings a bronze shield carved with swans in battle formation. Helen glances at it, unimpressed. Menelaus of Mycenae, red-haired, broad-shouldered, earnest in the way of someone who's always slightly out of his depth, brings 3 horses and a harpist. The harpist plays badly. Everyone pretends not to notice. And so on. Suitors parade themselves like exotic birds, posturing, reciting poetry, flexing in doorways. Helen listens politely, nods, says almost nothing, which only makes them try harder. Pollux watches the whole thing while chewing grapes with theatrical disinterest. Castor sharpens a dagger, not pointedly, but pointed enough. Meanwhile, Leda sits just behind her daughter, veiled, silent, a single hand resting on her lap. Every so often, her eyes close, not in exhaustion, but in calculation. She knows what's coming. Everyone does. Because you can't gather this many powerful men in one room and not expect someone to lose their temper. Sure enough, it happens just after dessert. One of the lesser princes, short, loud, overcompensating with too many rings, accuses another of bribery. Words are exchanged, then goblets, then chairs. The room erupts in shouting. Helen doesn't move. Tyndareus slams a staff on the floor. Enough. And that's when Odysseus, cool as winter wine, steps forward and offers a solution. Make them swear, he says, all of them. The room quiets. Make each man here vow, Odysseus continues, to honor the final choice, whoever wins Helen's hand. And if anyone dares steal her later, all others must rise in her defense. A silence falls so deep you can hear the figs softening in the bowl. It's a brilliant plan, really. A pre-war alliance disguised as a love pact. Historians still argue whether Odysseus devised it out of foresight or just wanted Penelope faster. Either way, the oath of Tyndareus is born that night, an unbreakable vow among Greek nobility that will, one day, become the foundation of a 10-year war. But that's later. Tonight the suitors swear. Each man cuts a lock of hair, places it in the sacred fire, speaks his oath with one hand over his heart and one eye on Helen, who watches them all with the quiet resignation of someone being handed her fate on a platter of nicely arranged cheese. The winner, of course, is Menelaus. Tyndareus announces it just before midnight, voice steady, expression unreadable. Menelaus bows. His brother Agamemnon smirks from the shadows. Helen inclines her head, nothing more. She says no words of acceptance, no vows of her own. Just silence, and yet no one protests. Because she's Helen. And to protest, Helen is like arguing with the tide. After the banquet, as the palace sleeps off its wine and swan-shaped pastries, Helen walks alone in the garden. You follow. She reaches the fountain, places her hands on the rim, looks up. I didn't choose him, she says softly, but maybe that's the point. The stars blink overhead, a breeze tugs her braid, the shadow of a bird passes over the moon. Menelaus, she repeats, testing the name like it belongs to someone else's story. Then she opens her hand. Inside, another feather. This one darker, gray at the edges, bent slightly like it's been carried a long way. She lets it go, watches it float, and for just a moment you could swear she smiles. But only for herself. Dawn arrives slow and syrupy, pooling over the hills like honey poured from the hands of a distracted god. Sparta wakes in fragments, boots on stone, sheep bleating, someone dropping amphory in the market with an eloquent curse that echoes across 3 alleys. You trail through the palace halls, where the embers from last night's banquet still glow in the hearths. The air smells of leftover wine and wilted garlands. Somewhere a flute plays softly, too early, too sweet, like it doesn't know the celebrations are over. Helen stands at the balcony again. Always the balcony. From up here you can see nearly everything, the rooftops, the winding roads, the smudge of sea in the far-off distance. But she's not watching any of that. She's watching the gate. Menelaus left this morning after the oaths were taken. He'll return in a fortnight, the messengers said, with a full retinue and gifts enough to impress every reluctant Spartan cousin. He's serious. He's respectful. He's very Menelaus. But Helen feels like someone who's been handed a polished cage. Not quite locked in, not quite free. Leda joins her on the balcony without speaking. She simply leans beside her daughter, resting one hand lightly on the carved stone. The silence between them is thick with questions neither of them wants to voice. Will it be enough? Helen finally asks. Leda doesn't look at her. Enough for what? For them to leave me alone. Leda sighs. No, but it will delay them. Sometimes that's the best we get. And that's the heart of it, isn't it? Everyone thinks this story, Helen's story, is about beauty, about choice, about love, but it's not really. It's about delay, control, timing, who gets to say when the story begins and who gets to survive the ending. Down in the courtyard, Castor and Pollux wrestle half-heartedly. Castor wins again. Pollux insists it was strategy. Neither of them is smiling. They've both changed, too. Pollux has grown taller, stronger, a little quieter. Castor more focused, more guarded. There's a new edge to them, like they're aware that being brothers no longer makes them safe. Rumors have begun to circulate, not just about Helen, but about the twins. Some say they're cursed. Others say they're destined to die young. And one theory, circulating only in the darker corners of Corinthian symposiums, claims that only one of them is real. That the other is a shadow, a reflection, a divine echo made flesh. Historians still argue over this, of course. They always do. But in Sparta, the boys shrug off the gossip with sparring and sibling bickering, as if they can punch prophecy into submission. At least for now. Back in the garden, Helen walks alone again. She finds the eggshells, still mounted on their little pedestals, beneath a marble awning now half covered in ivy. She brushes a leaf away from one. The surface gleams like polished pearl. She leans in and whispers something. You can't hear it. But the wind picks up. Later that night she dreams. You're there as always, floating on the edges of her thoughts. It's the riverbank again, the reeds, the hush of feathers. She's younger in the dream, barefoot, wrapped in linen, laughing as she chases a shape through the trees. And then the swan lands. Only this time it doesn't speak, doesn't glide. It stands, and slowly begins to shift. The wings fold inward, the feathers recede, legs stretch, neck shortens. A man now stands before her, broad-shouldered, pale-eyed, not quite Zeus, not quite anyone. "Why now?" she asks. His voice is like thunder inside a cloud. "Because you're ready." Helen steps back. Ready for what? The man, Zeus, or his memory, tilts his head. To become the storm they feared when you were still an egg. She wakes with a gasp. Leda is there immediately. Sits beside her, brushes her daughter's forehead with cool fingers, doesn't ask. But Helen says it anyway. He came back. Leda closes her eyes and nods once. Outside, the olive trees sway. The next morning, Helen walks to the temple alone. She doesn't take guards, doesn't wear jewels, just a plain white tunic and her swan clasp. At the altar, she kneels. The priestess gasps when she enters, not because of reverence, but because the oil lamps flicker violently. The smoke coils into strange shapes. The incense bowls hiss like coiled snakes. Helen says nothing, just places a single feather on the marble slab and whispers, "I am not yours, I never was." Historians don't record this moment. There's no official scroll, no marble carving. But afterward, the temple pigeons stop nesting for a season. The olive trees near the altar bloom too early, and for 3 days, the stars over Sparta flicker slightly out of alignment. Something changed. Helen changed. And not even Zeus could undo it now. The streets of Sparta are unusually quiet today, as if the city itself senses it's holding its breath. Even the dogs, normally boisterous and eternally committed to barking at passing carts, sit still in the shade. You drift through the upper quarters of the palace, where the rooms are open to the breeze and the scent of pressed lavender drifts lazily through linen curtains. Helen is packing. Well, technically, her attendants are packing. She's standing beside the trunk with her arms folded, watching every item as if it might betray her. Tunics in shades of rose, seafoam, and bone white. Gold-threaded sandals. A lyre she rarely plays. A bronze mirror she dislikes because it always reflects her too sharply. Everything is neatly folded, neatly stacked. She sighs not because of the effort, but because of what it all represents. She is leaving. Menelaus has returned, with fanfare, of course, trumpets, garlands, a long poem about how Helen's eyes once made the sun pause over Mycenae. He means well, which somehow makes it worse. His sincerity is a heavy cloak, and Helen is already overheated. The wedding will be tomorrow. The ceremony is set, the altar cleaned, the sacrificial bull polished. Yes, really. Someone assigned 2 servants just to scrub it with olive oil and good intentions. You catch a glimpse of Leda, standing on the opposite balcony, watching the garden below. She's dressed formally today, draped in dignity, but her hands are clenching and unclenching behind her back. She's not okay. But she is practiced. The night before the wedding, a feast is held in the grand hall. Fewer suitors this time, more relatives, and a few visiting kings who all pretend not to be assessing the wealth and political leverage displayed in every woven wall hanging. Pollux and Castor are there, of course. Castor is on his 3rd goblet of wine and refusing to speak to anyone taller than a goat. Pollux is charming, loud, and clearly uncomfortable in a tunic that someone insists he wear despite the fact that it doesn't breathe. Helen enters to a sudden hush. She wears a deep blue gown tonight, the color of twilight before a storm. Her swan clasp gleams faintly. Her hair is unbound, rippling like a question down her back. Everyone stares. She smiles, and the room exhales. You'd think there would be relief, right? That now, with the oaths sworn and the union sealed, Sparta could return to normal. But instead, there's a quiet dread thickening the wine. A collective sense that the story isn't settling, it's winding up. Even Menelaus looks slightly stunned, like a man who asked for a painting and received a living flame. Later, Helen slips out to the garden. You follow naturally. She finds the small grove behind the eastern wall, the one with the olive tree that grew bent sideways after lightning struck its roots years ago. She used to climb it once as a child. Now she stands beside it, hand pressed to the bark. I should feel different, she whispers. You float closer. I should feel settled. Isn't that what weddings are supposed to do? The wind rustles the leaves, but no answers come. From her pocket, she pulls something wrapped in silk. The feather. The last one. It's grayer now, faded, as if even divine fragments get tired. She turns it over in her hand, then speaks aloud, almost laughing. Well, is this it? Is this the grand plan, a pretty cage in Mycenae? I'd hoped for more imagination, honestly. The trees do not reply, but the sky does. Just a flicker, a strange light in the clouds, too soft for lightning, too slow for shooting stars. A presence. He's near. Again. You know it before she does. Zeus. Maybe watching, maybe more. He doesn't descend, doesn't speak. He's learned finally, perhaps, that Helen won't chase or beg or worship. She's not Leda. She's not some mortal girl distracted by feathers. She's herself now, and she knows it. She lifts the feather toward the sky, not offering, not returning, just showing him. This was yours, she says, but I was never part of it. Then she drops it, lets it fall onto the garden path, quiet as dusk, and walks away. Back to the palace. Back to the wedding. Back to the myth she's not sure she can stop, but which she refuses to sleep through. Fringe scholars point to this moment, the feather drop, as the true start of the Trojan War. Not the abduction, not the apple, not Paris. This. Helen choosing not to be owned. Of course, the songs don't mention it. Too quiet. Too subversive. But you were there. You saw the moment the storm turned inward. That night she doesn't sleep. Neither does Leda. Neither do you. You watch the torchlight flicker on stone walls, and you wonder, how long can a woman balance the weight of prophecy without letting it slip? The morning is pale and chilly, the kind of unexpected cool that slips in after a night too full of wine, tension, and half-finished songs. You glide softly through the waking palace as slaves whisper to one another and sweep away olive leaves blown in from the courtyards. Every movement feels ceremonial now, even the simple ones, tying sandals, pouring water, adjusting a hairpin. Today is the wedding. Helen sits before a polished bronze mirror, motionless. Attendants circle her like planets, pinning silk, smoothing hair, adjusting the ceremonial girdle that Leda insists must be tied, just so. A high priestess murmurs blessings into a bowl of saffron water. A musician quietly tunes a lyre in the next room, preparing to strum something soft and dignified as the bride enters the atrium. Helen doesn't flinch, doesn't blink. But you notice the faint mark just above her wrist, a pale oval where not long ago a feather rested. She wears no jewelry today except for a ring with a smooth amber stone and the Swan clasp on her shoulder. It feels like an insult or a warning, maybe both. Across the hall, Leda watches through a crack in the doorway. She doesn't interfere. Can't. She's done all she can. Instead, she clutches a pouch beneath her cloak, something wrapped in faded cloth. If you peek, you'd see a sliver of shell, the last bit, the piece she never gave to the priests. Historians still argue what Leda did with the eggshells. Some say she buried them beneath the roots of Sparta's oldest tree. Others claim she ground them into powder and fed them to Helen in her porridge for protection. The truth, she kept the largest fragment close to her heart. To remind herself this was real. As the ceremonial trumpet sounds, Helen rises. Her gown is stunning, Spartan in form but woven with fine Athenian thread. No excess, just strength disguised in silk. Her hair is braided down her back like a river that remembers where it's been. She walks slowly down the corridor, past fluted columns and flower-strewn paths, her sandals quiet on the stones. Everyone stares. Even the guards seem to hold their breath. She meets Menelaus in the Hall of the Gods, beneath an arch hung with olive branches and garlic braids to ward off ill omens. It smells like power and soup. Menelaus looks at her with open awe, maybe even love. Helen, in return, nods once. That's it. The priest begins the rites, hymns, sacrifices, the whole ceremonial checklist. Doves are released, honeycakes are broken, a sheep somewhere bleats in resigned disapproval. When it comes time for the vow, Menelaus speaks with his hand pressed to his chest. His voice is strong. I bind myself to you, Helen, as husband, as protector, and as one who honors the god's choice. She pauses before her reply. The priest clears his throat, someone coughs. And then she says it. I accept your oath. Not I bind myself. Not I love. Just I accept. It's not defiance. It's precision. Afterward, the wedding feast blooms like a field under sudden rain. Musicians play. Dancers whirl. Fruit and roasted birds spill from platters like blessings. You drift through the celebration, watching faces light with wine and relief. Pollux drinks too much and challenges a visiting prince to a foot race. Castor catches him before he trips into the roast boar. Leda smiles tightly at the nobles who greet her, one hand still resting over the pouch beneath her cloak. She eats little. Helen walks among her guests like someone performing in a play she's seen before. Graceful, composed, even kind, but her eyes, they keep flicking skyward. Because something is coming. That evening, as the sun melts behind the hills, a new visitor arrives. Uninvited. Unannounced. He doesn't come with a herald. No musicians, no doves. Just a ship, small, fast, and a name whispered through the banquet like the hiss of a struck harp string. Paris, Prince of Troy. Handsome, honey-voiced, cloaked in mystery and perfume. He is not here officially, not as a suitor, not as a diplomat. He says he's just passing through. But everyone knows. Especially Helen. She meets him at the edge of the garden, where the orange trees bloom thick and early this year, as if trying to impress. Paris bows not deeply. I've heard many stories about you. Helen watches him like a cat sizing up a bird, and yet you still came. His smile widens, wouldn't you? She doesn't answer. Not aloud. But in that moment, something shifts. Not love, not even attraction, just the undeniable sense that two storms have recognized one another. You can feel it too, can't you? That trembling undercurrent of something ancient finally awakening. Later that night, long after the guests have collapsed into dreams and wine-heavy silence, Helen walks alone again. She returns to the garden, stands beneath the olive tree struck by lightning years before. She places her hand on the bark and whispers one word. Soon. The wind rustles in reply. No feathers fall this time. Just petals, dozens of them, each landing softly at her feet. Sparta hums beneath a full moon, silvering every rooftop and turning the palace stones to polished bone. The feast has long since faded into drowsy laughter and the soft shuffle of servants gathering half-eaten figs. The wedding is over. The oaths have been spoken. The gods, presumably, have been satisfied. And yet, you can feel it. That delicate tension in the air, like a string pulled taut just before it snaps. Helen stands at her window, watching the moonlight crawl across her new chambers. They're larger than her old ones. Lavish, heavy with Mycenaean gifts, gold inlays, imported incense, a throne too wide for one person to sit in comfortably. She hasn't touched any of it. The only familiar thing here is the box. Her little carved box. Inside, the amber ring, 2 feathers, and a crescent-shaped shard of eggshell. She opens it now, traces each object with a finger, and then she does something strange. She removes the final feather, the one she told no one about, not even her mother. It's not pure white like the others. This one is mottled, speckled with faint gray swirls that shift when the light hits them. It feels warm. Alive. She places it on the floor. And waits. Nothing happens. Not for a long time. But you stay with her, you wait too. Because you know what's coming. And then finally it stirs. Not the feather, the air. It thickens, ripples, and in the corner of the room, just past the brazier, a shape begins to form. Not a swan, not a man. Something in between. Shadowed tall, eyes like stormlight. Zeus, or some version of him. He says nothing at first, just watches her. And she, to her credit, doesn't flinch. I thought you were done with me, she says evenly. He tilts his head. You've married me off, she continues. Turned me into legend, that should have been enough. His voice, when it comes, is wind moving through clouds. You are not legend, you are the beginning. Helen laughs softly. That's worse. He steps forward, the air warps. The candle flames dance like they're frightened. You are what makes the wheel turn. She looks at him, truly looks, and for the first time you realize she is not afraid of him. Not anymore, not even of what he represents. She steps closer. No, she says, I'm what breaks it. Zeus hesitates, not visibly, but you can feel it. And that's when she asks him the question no one else ever has. Do you even know why you chose me? A beat, then another's. Finally, because you were inevitable. Helen nods. That's what I thought. And just like that, the moment ends. He vanishes, not dramatically, no thunderclap or burst of flame, just a soft absence. The feather fades, the air smooths, the candlelight stops flickering. And Helen is alone again. Except she is. Because someone else saw. Someone else heard. From behind a column in the corridor, a servant steps back into shadow, breath caught in their throat. They'll talk. Of course they will. By morning the whispers will return. Of Zeus, of feathers, of glowing eyes and girls who speak to clouds. But Helen doesn't care. She places the box back beneath her bed, ties her hair, lies down on the too large bed with its too soft pillows and stares at the ceiling until the stars move. Elsewhere in the palace, Leda dreams of wings. She wakes with a start, heart pounding, certain that something has shifted. She pulls out the last scrap of parchment from the crooked feathers cave, a dream chart. 3 symbols scratched onto it, swan, serpent, flame. She stares at them for a long time. Meanwhile, Pollux and Castor are arguing again. Pollux claims he saw a shape outside the window. Castor insists it was just a shadow. Neither of them sleeps. In the hills above Sparta, the shepherds whisper that the moonlight didn't fall right last night. That it curved, like wings. Historians still argue whether this encounter ever happened. The canonical myths make no mention of Zeus appearing to Helen again after her birth. But there is a piece of pottery, shattered, incomplete, found near Turin's, depicting a woman holding a feather in one hand and a lightning bolt in the other. No name, no signature, but the style Spartan, and the subject unmistakable. Back in her chamber, Helen finally falls asleep, and dreams not of love or gods or palaces, but of sea spray and sails, of a city across the water. A name she doesn't know yet, Troy, whispers through her dreams like the hush before a battle hymn. She sleeps with her fist closed, and the box hidden beneath her bed hums softly just once. Then is still. The wind has changed. You feel it in the leaves, in the rhythm of temple bells, in the way even the palace dogs no longer bark quite so confidently. It's not just autumn approaching. It's the weight of something inevitable drawing nearer. Helen stands at the portico again, her veil fluttering like a second thought. She's watching the gates, but she's not waiting for Menelaus. She's waiting for a choice. Paris of Troy has lingered. More than a guest, less than a declared suitor. He arrived under the pretense of diplomacy, but now he strolls the palace gardens as if born into them. He jokes with Pollux, debates with Castor, flatters Leda with poetic asides that are somehow both clever and condescending. And Helen, she doesn't speak to him often. But when she does, it's never about politics. Always something else, dreams, stars, the weight of names. And once in passing, she asked, "What do you think would happen if I disappeared?" Paris had smiled, slow and soft, and replied, "The world would burn politely." And that was the beginning of the end. Or maybe the middle. Because here's what no one talks about in the myths. It wasn't just seduction, it wasn't just fate, it wasn't even divine meddling, though there was plenty of that. It was something quieter. Restlessness. Helen, born of feathers and silence, raised in a palace where even love felt like ceremony, had never been offered choice. Until Paris. And the apple, that golden apple inscribed to the fairest, awarded to Aphrodite in exchange for the most beautiful woman in the world. It wasn't about Helen. Not really. It was about power. The power to choose. And for once, Helen got to choose back. Historians still argue if Helen left willingly. Some versions say she was kidnapped, others claim she fell in love. But you were there. You saw the moment she stood in her chamber, dressed not in royal linen but in a plain travel cloak, with one hand resting on the carved box and the other holding a rolled scroll of names she never wanted to inherit. Leda came to her then. No shouting, no pleading. Just a glance. I dreamed of eggshells cracking, Leda said, voice steady, and a storm where the river should be. Helen nodded. It's not your fault. No, Leda replied, but you are still my daughter. They embraced once. Tightly. No tears. Just the soft hum of something ending. Castor and Pollux met her at the stables. They didn't ask questions. Pollux handed her a leather pouch of dried figs. Castor kissed her on the forehead and whispered, "You're still ours." Then they turned and walked away. Paris waited by the gate, cloak drawn tight, face unreadable. He didn't offer his hand, and she didn't ask for it. They walked side by side into the dark. That night the palace slept uneasily. Tyndareus stood on the balcony alone, fists clenched behind his back, the silver of his beard catching starlight. In the nursery, the last feather, once kept on its pedestal, crumbled into ash. The wind carried it into the sky. By morning, Sparta was awake. And Helen was gone. The news spread slowly at first. Then fast. Menelaus, when informed, stared blankly for a long time. Then turned, walked to the courtyard, and shouted, once. Just once. A sound that echoed down every corridor and snapped 3 olive branches from a nearby tree. The oath of Tyndareus was invoked. Ships were summoned, kings were rallied, shields polished, maps unrolled, war plans drawn across tables like constellation charts predicting doom. All for Helen, all because of a feather dropped years ago in a quiet garden. But here's what the epics won't tell you. On the ship to Troy, Helen didn't cry. She stood at the prow, wind in her hair, eyes on the horizon. Paris tried to speak. She raised a hand. Don't. He nodded, watched her quietly. And beneath the deck, in a sealed jar wrapped in cloth, she carried the pieces of her box. The amber ring, the broken feather, the shard of eggshell. Not as tokens of regret, but as evidence that once before she became a myth, she was real. That once she made a choice. And everything that came after. The war, the burning, the songs, none of it could undo that. Not even the gods. Troy rises from the sea like a carved promise, its walls high and honey-colored, its towers reaching into sky streaked with gulls and smoke. You float just above the harbor as Helen steps onto Trojan soil for the first time, the wooden planks beneath her sandals still warm from sun and salt. The city greets her with silence. Not fear, not joy. Just the hush, as if every stone is holding its breath. Paris escorts her through the gate, his hand never quite brushing hers. He speaks softly to the guards, nods to the priestesses lining the marble path. Everyone watches. No one speaks her name. But they all know it. You follow as she walks through the upper city, past courtyards and hanging gardens, past fountains shaped like lions and goddesses, past bronze shields arranged decoratively on palace walls, as if they've never been used and never will be. Troy is beautiful, but it's a beauty that knows it's being observed. And Helen walking through it is both guest and omen. Inside the palace, Queen Hecuba waits. She says the polite things, of course, welcomes, blessings, ambiguous remarks about destiny. Her smile is the kind worn by women who have weathered many storms and suspect another is brewing in the foyer. Helen responds with equal grace. No apologies. No explanations. Just stillness. They dine that evening beneath a dome of stars and lanterns, every seat filled with noblemen and strategists pretending this isn't a powder keg wrapped in silk. Priam, the king, sits at the head of the table, his face unreadable. Hector, Paris's older brother, keeps his gaze on the wine. Helen sits straight-backed, unmoved. The food is exquisite, the conversation cautious. At one point, a poet attempts a riddle about swans. Paris glares him into silence. Later in her chamber, Helen removes her sandals one by one and places them by the hearth. The box is there intact. She opens it. Inside, the ring, the broken feather, the crescent eggshell. She touches each object like checking for a pulse. Then she speaks. "Was this what you wanted?" The room does not reply, but the wind outside the balcony shifts. Back in Sparta, Leda walks the garden path alone. She has aged since the wedding, not visibly, but inwardly, as if each day has folded her a little more tightly inward. She pauses by the cracked olive tree, places a hand against the bark, whispers her daughter's name. That night she dreams. Of feathers, of flames, of a horse too large to fit through the city gate. She wakes with a gasp, sweat clinging to her palms, and immediately sends for the crooked feather's last scroll. The ink has faded, but one line remains. The daughter who holds the broken shell will choose the fire or the sea. Leda weeps quietly. The gods, meanwhile, are restless. Athena paces Olympus. She was promised the apple, promised recognition, and now this, a war beginning not with glory but with emotion. Aphrodite, smug but watchful, sips nectar and tells everyone to wait. Zeus says nothing. He stands at the edge of the clouds, watching Helen through a slit in the sky, knowing this time he has no more feathers to offer. Because the storm is already building. Odysseus has begun writing letters. Agamemnon sharpens a spear. The ships are being built. You return to Troy, to Helen's chamber, where she sits by the balcony with her back to the sea. Paris approaches her gently. "They'll come," he says. She nods. "I know. Do you regret it?" She turns, her eyes are tired, bright. "Ask me after the fire." The next morning, a dove flies into her chamber and lands on the box. It sits there, unmoving. Watching. You could call it coincidence. You could call it a sign. But Helen, she simply strokes its feathers once and says, "You're late." The dove does not coo, just flutters its wings and disappears. And as she turns back toward the balcony, you feel it again. The trembling in the wind. The weight of ships just below the horizon. And somewhere across the sea, a city called Sparta sharpens its knives. You drift now over the open sea, somewhere between Sparta's coast and Troy's high towers, where the water glitters deceptively calm. But beneath that surface, there's movement, currents that twist like thoughts, silent preparations too large to see up close. Ships. So many ships. You can't count them all, not yet, but they're coming. Black-hulled, sharp-prowed, sails taut with vengeance. The kings are rallying. The oath of Tyndarus, once just an elegant dinner party agreement, is now a divine contract scribbled in blood and ambition. All because of Helen. Or so they say. But back in Troy, she walks the gardens. She watches the children play by the lotus pool. She listens to priests chant in the morning haze. She tends to a potted olive tree gifted by a Trojan noblewoman who clearly fears her and respects her in equal measure. She writes letters she never sends. She counts birds. She speaks less. Paris tries to distract her. He gifts her perfumes, foreign silks, a lapdog with ears too large for its head. Helen smiles at them all, says thank you, places them gently aside. But her eyes remain distant. One evening, as the sky bruises into twilight, she sits at her balcony and tells the air, "They're almost here." Paris enters behind her, pausing in the doorway. He doesn't deny it. "I saw their sails in a dream," she adds, "like teeth." He sits beside her, not too close. "They'll come for me," she says, voice calm. "They'll come for us," he replies. She doesn't correct him, but you feel the quiet in her chest where disagreement waits. That night, Helen walks alone to the temple of Apollo, candle in hand. The priests allow her in without question. She kneels before the statue, the flame flickering in the breeze from the open columns. She places something on the altar. The box, the ring, the feather, the eggshell shard. All of it. She leans forward and whispers something. You don't catch the words. And then she walks away, leaving the box behind. The priests will later claim the box disappeared. That one moment it was there, the next it was gone. Some say it crumbled, some say it flew. Others believe Apollo himself took it. Historians still argue if the box ever existed at all. But you know, you saw, you remember. Back in Sparta, Leda receives a message from a messenger wearing a Trojan pin. No words, just a swan feather scorched at the tip. She understands. That night, she burns the last of her dream scrolls and sits by the fire, whispering all her children's names like a spell to keep them safe. It doesn't work. The armies gather now. Agamemnon calls himself commander of the Greeks. Odysseus pretends to grumble but sharpens his tongue. Achilles, barely more than a boy, rolls his eyes at every speech and tests the limits of his immortality in sparring matches. No one survives twice. The drums beat. The oars dip. And over the waves, carried like prophecy, rides the single sentence that will shape the next decade. Helen must be returned. But Helen, she's no longer in their story the way they think. They talk about her as symbol, as cause, as thing. But in Troy, she wakes each day and walks the ramparts, not as a prisoner, not as a wife, not as a goddess in training. Just as Helen, watcher of skies, daughter of a woman who laid eggs, bearer of a story no one's ready to hear. One evening, she sees the first ship, far on the horizon, then 2, then 7. The wind picks up. Paris grips the balcony, knuckles pale. They're here, he says. She says nothing, only turns to face the sea, and smiles, not out of joy, but readiness. It has begun. And somewhere in Olympus, Zeus watches the rising storm with quiet resignation. Aphrodite closes her mirror. Hera turns away. Athena sharpens her spear. And the gods, ever bored, lean forward. Because the feathers have settled. The shell is broken. And now the story flies. The drums are louder now. You hover above the plains before Troy, where the dust hangs in the air like ash from a slow-burning fire. The Greek ships, hundreds now, line the coast like teeth. Their sails are furled. Their warriors disembark in waves. Shields gleam. Bronze armor clinks like distant bells. The war has not yet begun. But everyone can feel it. In the city, Troy braces itself. Gates are reinforced. Temples are scrubbed. Priests chant louder longer as if sound can stop fate. Children are sent inland. Market stalls sell charms against divine wrath, ribbons, bones, bits of ash said to be from Helen's footprints. She watches from the walls. Not in hiding. Not in shame. Just watching. Hair braided back, swan clasp shining faintly in the light. Her tunic simple, her posture perfect. You stand beside her, invisible as ever. It's strange, she murmurs, how quiet it is before everything changes. Paris stands behind her, silent. He no longer pretends she's a prize. He knows now, if he didn't before, that Helen was never anyone's to keep. He says nothing, just grips the edge of the stone and tries not to imagine what 10 years of war will cost. Helen speaks again, softly. They'll call it the war for my beauty. A pause. They won't understand. And you know she's right. The songs will say this was about lust or pride or a stolen queen. They'll sing of Menelaus's rage, of Agamemnon's banners, of Achilles' wrath and Hector's fall. They'll say Helen stood by, aloof, untouchable. They'll never sing about the egg, or the swan, or the feather left under her pillow. They'll forget the long years of her silence, the quiet refusals, the dreams she never asked for, the war she tried to walk away from before it was even an idea in a poet's mouth. But you will remember, because you were there. When she stared into the sky and said, "Not yet." When she whispered at the altar, "This isn't mine." When she dropped the feather and chose herself, knowing full well the storm would follow. Below, the soldiers begin shouting. War horns sound, the Greeks march. The first skirmish sparks like flint. Helen turns away. She walks through the palace halls as calmly as if heading to supper. People bow, servants scurry. She nods once slowly, nothing hurried, nothing frantic. She steps into the inner garden, the one no one else uses anymore. A fig tree leans over the path. The old olive tree still stands, even here in Troy, a cousin to the one in Sparta. The breeze smells like salt and crushed leaves. She kneels and places one hand against the dirt. Closes her eyes. Breathes in. There is no thunder. No god appears. No feather falls. But something in the air loosens, like a fist unclenching. Because the moment has passed, Helen is no longer an object. No longer a prophecy. She's a storm given shape. A choice wearing sandals. And now, with the armies colliding below and the gods preparing speeches, she does the only thing she can do. She lets go of Sparta, of Olympus, of the box she left behind, and rises, not as a queen, not as a legend, but as herself, Helen of now, Helen of no master, Helen who once whispered to a feather and heard it whisper back. The war will rage for years. Heroes will fall. Cities will burn. Songs will echo across centuries. And still, none of them will truly explain what happened. But you know, because you were there when she turned to the sky one final time, and said nothing, only closed her eyes, and smiled. And now the war fades. The ships drift from your mind like clouds across a sleeping sky. The clang of bronze, the shouting of names, the echoes of fate, soften, blur, dissolve into a hush. You're no longer in Troy. You're back beneath a quiet olive tree, where feathers rest gently on the earth and the wind sings lullabies through its branches. The gods, bored once more, return to their cloudy thrones. The myths retreat behind curtains of mist. Helen is gone. Or perhaps she simply stepped out of the story for now. She's walking alone, barefoot through a dream where no one needs her to be beautiful or legendary or blamed. Just still, and you too can rest now. There are no more riddles tonight, no oaths to break, no thrones to defend. Only the softness of night settling in. You stretch out on cool stone, the stars blinking above like old friends. A breeze stirs your hair. The scent of fig and cedar drifts by, light as memory. Breathe. Let your thoughts ripple gently outward, like feathers on a pond. You are safe. You are far from Troy. And tomorrow is not your concern. For now, sleep finds you not with trumpets or fire, but with the whisper of wings. Soft, steady, gaunt,